Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. My name is Sarah Grant-Clement, and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. The focus of today's webinar is on technology advances in uncrewed systems and the implication of these advances to these systems. Uncrewed systems have a variety of different names, such as unmanned systems, drones, remote-controlled vehicles, unmanned combat vehicles, and many more. You will likely hear a range of different terms used in this webinar, but in essence, uncrewed systems are comprised of a vehicle, which can operate without personnel on board, and, if remote-controlled, a remote control system enabling the operation at distance of the vehicle. And uncrewed systems exist and operate in all domains, in the air, on the ground, and in the maritime space. Aerial systems are the most common and likely the type of uncrewed system most people are familiar with. Indeed, having first started being used within military operations, uncrewed aerial systems, or UAS, have increasingly proliferated and also entered the civilian domain as technological advances have enabled them to become smaller while at the same time increasingly efficient. But the proliferation of UAS can also be explained beyond simply technological factors, and indeed their areas of application are many beyond the military domain, with UAS being used for tasks as wide-ranging as peacekeeping to agricultural support. Meanwhile, similar developments have also emerged for uncrewed systems in the maritime and land domains. Particularly in the maritime domain, we are seeing a keen interest and development of systems which can operate either on the surface or both on the surface and underwater. Furthermore, and similarly to the air domain, the maritime domain is regarded as relatively uncluttered and uncomplicated. Uncrewed systems destined for the land domain, however, face many obstacles. Indeed, of the three domains, the land is the hardest one to navigate in. A high endurance is needed to increase the usefulness of these systems. They must be able to manage navigation of many different types of obstacles, as well as being able to operate on many different types of surfaces. So not just nicely paved roads, but also muddy, wet, rocky, or hilly conditions, to name but a few. The land domain, therefore, has more challenges in terms of its environment than the air or maritime domains. And you may be wondering to yourself, why does technology matter? And while technology and technological advances are one amongst a range of factors which impact upon the growing use of uncrewed systems, technology has an undeniable impact on the attractiveness and abilities of uncrewed systems. UNIDIR has explored this through a series of 3 primers, one on each system, as well as a compendium, which provides a comparative overview that highlights the common developments and security implications of uncrewed aerial, ground, and maritime systems, as well as what distinguishes them from one another. And indeed, these publications do show that technological advances matter. However, in the interest of leaving sufficient time for our distinguished speakers to discuss these matters in more detail, I will stop here and only recommend that you read these short publications at your leisure. And the focus of this webinar is very much on looking at technology in its kind of broader circumstances. And of course, the issue of autonomy and lethality in uncrewed systems is a topic already under much scrutiny, including in UN fora. A holistic understanding of the broader set of technological capabilities pertaining to these systems is crucial in order to fully understand their risks to and impact on international security. Taking artificial intelligence as an example, it is true that it enables new capabilities, opportunities, and threats, but it is also important to contextualize its integration and use within a system as a whole. So for example, the impact of AI capabilities need to be understood in the broader context of whether a system has sufficient endurance, what is its payload capacity, and whether it is or not subject to export controls, and if so, whether it is considered a dual-use item or purely a military object. So, as you can see, while issues such as AI in itself are important, understanding a system's capability as a whole can contextualize the threat as well as the opportunities. To that end, we have with us today a fantastic panel of experts to discuss both the technology and its impact across different domains of operations. I will start by introducing them briefly before turning to my questions. And in no particular order, we are joined by today Dr. Dominika Kunartova, who's a senior researcher on international security, NATO, and emerging technology at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. She has expertise on the geopolitics of emerging and disruptive technologies, military robotics, and security and defense, and has written extensively on drone technology and drone use. Next, we have Mr. Abhijit Singh, a senior fellow and head of the Maritime Policy Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation, based in New Delhi, who has solid expertise on maritime matters, including security and governance issues, not least due to his prior experience as a naval officer and his involvement in the writing of India's 2007 maritime strategy. And last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Caitlin Lee, Senior Fellow for the Mitchells Institute Center for Unmanned and Autonomous Systems, with expertise in aerospace strategy, operations, and technology, with a focus on the role of unmanned systems, autonomy, and artificial intelligence and machine learning in contributing to aerospace power. Before we get started, I just wish to remind the audience that you have the possibility of, and indeed are encouraged to ask questions throughout the event using Zoom's Q&A function, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A section of this webinar. So without any further ado, I will turn to you first, Dominika, to first do a first foray into the aerial domain. And uncrewed aerial systems, or UAS, continue to be the most widely used type of uncrewed system to date, within both the military and the civilian domains. And I'm wondering if you could just expand on what you see as being the main technological innovations impacting UAS as a whole. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for a kind introduction, and thank you, UNIDIR, for having me today. So for my short intervention, I decided to focus on recent technological innovations inspired by the battlefield itself, so on the ongoing war in Ukraine. And this to a point to give the audience some food for thought, because sometimes talking about new technological advances is more focused on sensational statements rather than some incremental changes. And I believe it's important to nuance certain news, So I will give you 3 points. So first of all, that the new technology doesn't always have to be high tech. It's very much low tech or low cost. It's not always that sophisticated, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have any impact. So just to tell, like, imagine the technological span from drones as a large platforms as big as an aircraft, right, able to carry missiles, to the absolute lower end of cardboard drones, as one Australian company is shipping them, filled in a box of pizza size, right? So that's just to illustrate the diversity in drone systems. So that's a first point. Second point is the commercial origins of some new technological innovation, let's say, in aerial uncrewed systems. Just think about the platforms where you order books or new socks. So this is also where you can order drone platforms. And suddenly you have hobbyist drones that are turned into loitering grenades. So that's my second point. And the third point is the very logic behind the use of drones has been changing. In the past 2 decades, as I believe Caitlin and can tell way more about it, the image of drone was this large platform used to chase terrorists, carrying missiles, providing permanent surveillance of the ground from the sky, like a NATO Aegis system, right? And then it was basically used to project air power without sending troops in the area of the conflict. Whereas what we see today, not only in Ukraine, but also across Middle East, or also in African countries, in the area of conflict zones, that these drones are used less as to project power than being used as ammunition, as one-way attack drone. first of all. So they are used to as a consumable weapon, less as a platform. So that in my view makes a whole lot of difference, because then it's not the sophistication of the system, the performance of sensors that is the driving logic, but the low cost, the ability to inflict damage, in contrast to provide the permanent eye in the sky, let's say. So in this sense, drones have boots, right? So because they are operated by the individual on the ground, they can empower the individual, in contrast with the large platforms that were operated thousands of kilometers far away from the front line. So yeah, so I think I will stop here, and I will look forward to what my colleagues have to say, and then yeah, I will be happy to expand on the impact of these changes on the overall advancement of this technology, but also what it means for the dynamics of the conflict and the character of war. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dominika. That was fascinating. There's so many elements within your response that I want to dive deeper in. And I really liked what you said about it's not just the sensational statements, but the incremental changes that we may not be as aware of, which are making the difference. And maybe now this two-tier approach in terms of how you have very high-tech systems, but at the same time, very low-tech systems. And I'm thinking from confidence building mechanism and export controls, how do you deal with this dichotomy? But of course, this event is not just focused on UAS, which is why I want to turn to you next, Abhijit, and hear your thoughts regarding uncrewed maritime systems, or UMS. Indeed, many of the developments, technological developments, relate to enabling technologies that are common to all systems, such as relating to endurance, sensors, computing power, and more. So the advances that we see in one domain, such as the aerial domain, may be transferable and likely to occur in other types of systems too, albeit, of course, with differences in terms of how these may be integrated or what is most relevant. I am mentioning this as increasingly we're seeing not only the development, but also the use of UMS. And at the same time, the maritime domain has specific complexities, for example, regarding the lack of a clear legal status of UMS and legal questions regarding the application of the laws of armed conflict in international waters. My question to you, therefore, has several parts to try and capture this complexity. First, how do you see the interaction between technological progress and the use of UMS from a legal and ethical perspective? And second, what are the technical challenges of operating UMS? And therefore, where may we see future technological advances to overcome these, if applicable? You have the floor.
Thank you, Sarah, at the outset for inviting me to this excellent webinar. UMS, or unmanned maritime systems, is quite the issue of discussion among maritime analysts these days. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak to you and the audience today. So I'm going to break down your very complicated question into two parts. The first half of, as I understand your question, is about the advancements in technology as regards UMS, and second, how does this comport with ethical and legal norms? So let me just tackle the first part of it first. So the innovations in maritime systems technology in the UMS domain are pretty significant, and one finds that these advancements span right across the spectrum of operations and capabilities. So if you're talking, say, aerial systems that are relevant in the maritime domain, or underwater systems, or surface platforms, everywhere across, we are finding a great deal of advancement that has come in terms of the fact that now we have new kinds of robots for waters. So what used to be called as drones are now being categorized as robot ships, or robot underwater vessels. And they have improved autonomy. There is better command and control. The communication systems are much better with talk now. At least in India, I see of quantum technologies being used to enhance communication, and communication is a problem area as far as drones is concerned, because the bandwidth that is available at sea is much less than what it is for drones on land or perhaps in the air. So communications are now much better, and now there's talk of installing AI networks and AI infrastructure. But this is an area where there has been less progress. This is still very much a work in progress, so to speak, and a lot more needs to be done. The main thrust of the UMS effort, I would posit, is still the UUV, or the unmanned underwater vehicle. And the reason, I think, is that a number of countries now find that they are in an age of great power competition, where the threats are rising, and a lot of these countries feel that the underwater domain presents the most decisive advantages. And therefore, there's much effort to developing, small swarm drones, ISR drones, which is surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence collection drones, and larger UUVs for things like mine countermeasures or ASW or anti-surface. So really 3 or 4 categories or 3 or 4 lines of effort where the endeavor seems to be to get in more technology, to have superior drones that are, and to be able to dominate the tactical battlefield or at sea, so to speak. But I would say there is also a very competitive credo, call it a hunt or be hunted credo, that is driving these efforts. Many believe that these disruptive technologies are a reality, and one either has to be on the receiving end of it, or perhaps try and use these technologies for your own benefit. So UMS for many maritime forces, as I noted, is a way of just increasing your capability, your tactical space for maneuver, and to increase your reach. But more importantly, this is a way of de-risking your crews, your crewed platforms. You don't want them to go in harm's way. You don't want the submarines to be going too close to the adversary. You want other platforms to be able to do that. And that gives a nation and a navy asymmetric advantage in the maritime domain. The other driver of the UUV initiative, I would posit, especially from a middle power perspective, I would say is coastal security. Again, there is this heightened awareness among many governments that the coastal security architecture is weak. There are gaps, and there are many of the threats arise from the sea. What's happening is that threats now are shifting from the blue water to the littorals. And the littorals are very congested. And when you're talking about congested spaces, the detection becomes all the more difficult and complicated in a very congested environment. And therefore, you need specialist vehicles to be able to do that. So a lot of effort is actually going into ISR, into developing the drones for having, surveillance, monitoring, tracking, etc. I would say that transforming this big vision that all of us have, that many countries and nations have of developing specialist drones, has again been a work in progress. We're on different points of the evolutionary curve. Some countries, I notice, I can sort of give the example of, because I follow the maritime domain closely. For example, NAVCENT, the Task Force 59, has been doing a significant amount of work trying to develop these drones. In India, also, there's a lot of emphasis on developing prototypes, but we are still grappling with developing the essential models and technology demonstrating models that would enable these drones to be incorporated into the force and be used on a longer term basis. Now, to the second part of your question, which is what does this say of international? Does this jibe well with ethics and legality? So it's not clear if unmanned maritime systems enjoy the status of ships under the UNCLOS or the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. It cannot be said with any degree of certainty whether these are warships. And this is something that I'm going to discuss during the Q&A. But the law actually, whilst it does not permit or it does not preclude, I would say, the use of UMS in either peacetime or armed conflict, the law does seem to have a problem with using unmanned vessels for aggressive purposes and to target manned platforms. So there's a debate that is going on. There's nothing black and white, but there are two sides to this, in which one side seems pretty clear that the manner in which we are developing unmanned drones and the manner in which we are trying to infuse AI into these drones, allow AI to take the big decisions of how those drones would target manned platforms. There is something inherently problematic about the usage of these platforms. But from an operational standpoint, I would say that the other issue is also doctrinal. The fact is that there is no easy way to incorporate uncrewed operations into doctrine, because the fact is that many of these technologies are in a nascent stage of development, and there's little clarity about what complications they might entail. So military doctrine is actually premised on a very traditional and safe understanding of conflict, which is that there are rules and codes to be followed. There is the dictum of necessity and proportionality. But once you get in machines, and once you get in AI-enabled machines, there's no telling what the machines make of proportionality and what they make of necessity, because the machines does not have the neural networks to be able to show empathy and take a considered decision over whether force is required in a particular situation or not. So it is a lot more complicated in the maritime domain, because we are dealing with the global commons, and you've got to make sure that whatever you do, it is consistent with the law. That's where I'm going to stop, but I'm going to say more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was so comprehensive and fascinating. I've been scribbling away as you've been talking. There's so much to unpack, and I do very much look forward to unpacking some of these issues at the Q&A. Indeed, the maritime domain has very much these particularities that you mentioned, but also I was struck during your answer about the overlaps in terms of the issues and the types of discussions which have already occurred and continue to occur in the aerial domain, which show that despite such differences, there are a lot of similarities, and perhaps the pathway of evolution and threats and opportunities that we may see across both domains, and there may be space or room for much more needed discussion on this. And of course, within all of this, technological advances and whether or not they are applied to uncrewed systems do not occur in a vacuum, and that's something you hinted to in your answer. And I think this is a really neat segue over to Caitlin, for you to be able to explain to us what factors may hamper or, on the other hand, enable innovation as it relates to uncrewed systems.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And thank you so much for having us all here today. I think it's great to have this discussion in this forum. So I think, to kind of think about what some of the factors are that are enabling innovation right now in the UAV sphere, I think Dominika hit on it a little bit, where what we're really seeing is the democratization of military power. Like, you're seeing that on the ground in Ukraine. We're seeing the proliferation of these disruptive technologies across a wide swath of actors, state actors, non-state actors, and right down to individuals, is exactly what we see in Ukraine. And that really does have the potential to change global power dynamics. And so I would say that this proliferation of technology into the hands of everyone down to civilians, and the dual use nature of this commercial technology is a major enabler of UAV innovation. And really what this is, I think, is a classic example of disruptive innovation. So this is a term developed in the 1990s in the business literature to refer to the commercial sector and this idea of these new technologies that pop onto the market and at first don't actually seem all that useful or fit to purpose. People kind of go, what do I do with this? But then they start to play with this technology and realize that it's cheap, it's simple, it's convenient. If I adjust it a little bit this way, the user can really make a lot out of it. So if you think about the transition from a flip phone to a smartphone, like a BlackBerry wasn't like that interesting, but an iPhone is awesome and we do everything on it. And so if you apply that sort of model to what we're seeing in, for example, Ukraine, you have these quadcopters and octocopters that have been flying around in the commercial market for a while as hobby drones. And you put them in the hands of Aerodivizga and they're like, all right, what can I do with this in trench warfare? this thing only has a flight time of 46 minutes. Well, I can use it for artillery spotting. I can get over some Russian fixed positions and start to put in some precision fires. I can even strap some mortars onto this thing and use it for direct attacks on the tops of tanks. So I think what we're seeing is this classic use of this kind of diffusion of innovation and disruptive technology into like a wide variety of users. And because you're doing that, it's like a virtuous cycle in a sense, because once you put this technology in the hands of users, they then develop better ways to employ it. And I think the other thing Dominika hinted at, which is very important, is that what we see in Ukraine is this competition between the two sides to sort of evolve this technology, and that's innovation in progress. So Ukraine is a real battlefield, proving ground for this technology, and we'll continue to see it evolve. And so I think this bottom line in terms of what is the key enabler of UAV innovation right now, I do think it's really this proliferation of new, cheap, easy to use UAVs and associated technologies, which I think are still evolving, things like, you know, artificial intelligence, semiconductors getting smaller. These things are helping with that UAV innovation. But that proliferation of this UAV technology on the battlefield is in itself sort of an enabler of innovation, because it in turn gets users using this in practical ways to solve real operational problems. So that's a key enabler of the UAV technology today. I think sort of the biggest factor that could potentially hold back UAV innovation is sort of uniquely a problem, sort of ironically, for great powers. So I know I can say this is true for the US, and I think it could be true to some extent for China and Russia, that in the US, we really focus on, we do not focus on disruptive innovation. We talk about it all the time, but in reality, our system is optimized for sustaining innovations, making incremental changes to exquisite weapon systems over a long period of time. That's how we have evolved our stealth capabilities, for example, and our precision guided munitions capabilities. And I think it's really hard to shift the Department of Defense mindset to think more about the commercial sector and dual use technologies and how to bring in these non-traditional players into the defense space. I think this could also be an issue for Russia and China. You know, Russia puts a lot of federal money into its R&D, but there is a question about how that affects the flexibility, vibrance, and competition in the private sector. If it's all federal money, you know, is that really the most dynamic way to fuel innovation? China, of course, has its military civil fusion strategy. I know much less about that. I think we all sort of know less about that, and it's still evolving. But that seeks to sort of balance sort of this government investment and government ability to harness the private sector and direct the private sector with this idea of like, there's more vibrancy in the private sector. And so which of those three great powers is best able to harness the private sector and commercial dual use is going to have a major advantage in this competition. And I think right now for the US, we are not in the head on that. And so that is something that's holding it back for us. And I think one other point I'll make about things that are constraining UAV innovation, I mean, the obvious one here is, of course, the introduction of artificial intelligence. And we really haven't seen this too much in the battlefield yet. I think we've seen hints of it. You think about something like the Harpy loitering munition that essentially is a fire and forget weapon, where you go tell it, go hit this kill box, find the things that match up with your target set, find the air defenses that match with your target set and kill them, and don't ask me about it. So we do have those kinds of things in the battlefield, but we mostly don't. We mostly do not have lethal autonomous weapons in the battle space. And an open question for humanity is how fast this technology is going to evolve, and what we need to do about it to sort of create some norms around it. I think Abby discussed this a little bit too. So another huge constraining factor is just trying to think ahead and be planful about the implications of AI for everything from the tactical up to the strategic level, and how kind of giving as we enter the world of thinking machines, how much authority we like actively want to give them, how much decision authority will they sort of take without us even noticing? And so I think that's a huge issue that we'll also have to monitor, and in a sense constrains us, because especially in the US, we do have things like DoD 3000.09, which is a new policy on lethal autonomous weapons that puts a pretty rigorous review process in place, because we want to signal to the world, hey, we're doing this thoughtfully and in a way that complies with LOAC, with proportionality and distinction. At the same time, we need to build the best weapon systems we can for deterrence.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was so fascinating. And everything that you highlighted, it just shows how multifaceted and complex this issue is, and how all of these thematics impact upon each other. And just shows that also we don't want to harm beneficial technology advancements. And I guess that's another part of the discussion, is how do we strike the right balance? I see that we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, but I will use my moderator privileges to ask one final question before we turn to those. And so it's a question I'm going to put to all of you. And it is, what do you see as being the main implications of technological advances to uncrewed systems themselves, but also to peace and security more broadly? And related to that, what should we, either as policymakers, civil society, or researchers, particularly be paying attention to? So for this question, I don't know if you feel up for going straight again after just speaking, Caitlin, but I was thinking we could go Caitlin, Dominica, and hand over to Abhijit for the last words, if that order suits you.
I'm up for it, Sarah.
Perfect.
All right, so I'll fire away here. I think, so if I'm thinking about sort of the biggest implications of technological advances, both for UAVs themselves and for peace and security, I'm going to have to talk about artificial intelligence. For me, that's really the biggest thing that's moving very fast and could have really changed both the way we operate UAVs and also sort of even could have broader potentials on sort of the overall military balance. So right now, of course, as I mentioned, most of our UAVs, all of our UAVs are in some sense remotely controlled by a human. So even if you think about, and that can be all the way from, like, if we think about the MQ-9 Reaper, the Air Force's, main UAV, that is literally flown by someone sitting in a ground control station. Then we move to something like Global Hawk, where it's a little more deterministic. It's, we have those in NATO as well. And the idea is you sort of pre-program a flight path. But right now, essentially, UAVs are controlled with a human in the loop. And in the US, there's a really big discussion about how that's going to change in the future as we have more access to autonomy that's enabled by artificial intelligence. So if we think about autonomy as machine independence from human control, AI, artificial intelligence, is going to be a huge enabler of that, because it basically allows you to develop machines that start to make their own decisions and take on human tasks. And so if you're interested in autonomy, you're interested in AI. And AI, as you all know, is moving very fast. We have things like ChatGPT that are giving us, starting to give us the ability to answer questions rationally and logically. And so the technology is moving very fast. And so I think this is going to have some real implications for UAVs, sort of tactically, but right on up to the strategic level. So, I mean, the most obvious one, I think, with AI is it speeds up decision-making, and it's also very efficient. So an example of this is Alpha Dogfight, which is a DARPA program that pitted a human fighter pilot against an AI agent and told them to go duke it out in a 1v1 dogfight. They ran this kind of series of events. I think it was like 16 times. And every time the AI won, because it could just outturn the fighter pilot and think faster than the fighter pilot. So it could get off shots that a human could never get off. And so one thing that AI does tactically is it really speeds up decision-making and allows you to get in your adversary's decision-making cycle. And if you sort of apply that to the geopolitical environment, what it means is that countries that are able to rapidly develop and field AI-enabled drones could have, or any kind of maritime systems, et cetera, could have a real advantage in battles in terms of going the offensive for a quick win, because they can make decisions much faster. Now, in practice, I think that the way this technology is proliferating, it's going to be hard to control, and it's going to proliferate to a wide variety of users. So I'm not sure you're going to see that instability, because I think it's going to proliferate kind of across the globe. I don't know that any one great power or non-state actor is going to have the monopoly on this technology. But certainly those who do possess it will be able to move more quickly. And if they see targets of opportunity, ways to break long simmering stalemates in conflicts, for example, they'll be able to use this technology to do that. The other thing that AI allows you to do is operate with this incredible amount of efficiency. So AI plays to win. It optimizes to achieve a goal. So when we write these algorithms, we write them so that they'll be able to do something effectively. And the AI can kind of look at the whole environment and be very ruthless and efficient with resources to achieve that goal. So in addition to going fast, it's also very efficient. It's going to get to the goal without wasting time or potentially other resources. So at the same time, it can force the adversary to make mistakes. So from a warfighting perspective, this is another reason that AI could provide a real advantage, especially tactically, in terms of being able to act faster and without making mistakes and forcing the adversary to make mistakes. And we've seen this play out in sort of chess games where there's been a human pitted against an AI, and the AI just makes these sort of like viciously rational moves, sacrifices pawns for reasons that the other player can't even understand to go for a win later. And so being that ruthless with resources is another advantage. But, you know, there's some major, you know, obviously disadvantages to this development of AI. Even if we do it with the best intentions, it's not infallible. So it can have real advantages for warfighting, which potentially could cause some instability issues from a global perspective, although I'm not so sure about that because of the way it's going to proliferate. But certainly the other thing about the AI is that it can operate in ways that increase the risk of miscalculation or inadvertent escalation. So first of all, it can perform in ways that we can't fully predict. So it'll optimize toward that goal, but like we don't always understand exactly how it's going to get there. And so as a user of the AI, we have to work, and especially from a warfighting perspective, we have to worry about, you know, LOAC and how we program these algorithms to ensure that, you know, in order to get to the goal, they're not sacrificing civilians or even other friendly forces. The other thing with AI is that it's very brittle. And so right now it's very brittle. And so it may perform very well in very structured environments, like the chess game example I gave, where, you know, we can all see the chessboard and the AI just has infinite ways of understanding moves on that chessboard. Well, the battle space obviously has fog and friction and is very dynamic. And so it's much harder to optimize the AI to deal with that uncertainty at this point in time. And again, the technology is moving very quickly. And so we make it better at that. But right now, that's another issue. And then finally, the AI can be spoofed. It's possible for adversaries to kind of get inside our AI and make it think it's seeing, you know, a military target when in fact it's a civilian one. And so that's another risk for the inadvertent escalation. So I do think AI is really, for me, the big rock in terms of what's going to change UAV technology in the next 10, 15 years, as well as the one thing, if I have to name one technology that I think could have some broader implications for sort of strategic stability, I think it is the AI.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Without further ado, Dominika, do you want to go next?
Yes, of course. Thank you. I agree with Caitlin in this respect that the military applications of AI. Well, AI is always better soldier than a general as of now. So, I was thinking about your question, Sarah, more in shorter terms, and I was thinking about the factor of cost. To highlight the enabler and impact of these technological advances. I was talking about like the more low-tech, mid-tech technology, commercial origins, meaning that the technology is accessible, is affordable, it's user-friendly, meaning also that it's easy to maintain and also easy to replace. And so meaning that you can also deploy more of this stuff. More of this stuff is flying and in unusual, like new, let's say new altitude. So I will highlight that the verticality matter more and more for planning land operations. That the ground forces not only plan in terms of what is happening around them, but also above them, as some researchers point to the emergence of air littoral, also the first 3 kilometers above the ground, which are like basically populated by these lower flying drones, by loitering munitions. So it's one thing. And then logically, this means also that the cost ratio is not favorable for defense, that always the defense system is the use of defense system is more costly than the cost of the aerial threat that is trying to neutralize, right? So this this has still needs to be figured out, like how to counter, especially the small UAVs, right? That's in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality. We hear a lot about swarming tactic. But as of now, I believe that also misses a little bit of the point when we're talking about AI-enabled swarms. Already right now, if the objective is to overwhelm the defense systems, just the adversary just has to deploy numerous like pre-programmed drones or different drones using different radio frequency, and the defense system can get overwhelmed. So already now, in terms of like a quantitative challenge to these defense systems, this is still not addressed well with the countering drone technology. So these are two things. Last one is the easy spread or easier spread of this technology. So the proliferation of dual use components, that to me that's something that requires more policy attention, because the militarization and weaponization of commercial technologies is not going to go anywhere. And I believe it's not only that, but also the homegrown industry that requires more like corporate responsibility, let's say, like raising awareness of how the components of the civilian technology can be put into military purposes. So better oversight, better confidence building measures. So yeah, so I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Abhijit, over to you for the last words on this question.
Right, so I'm going to make 2 points. One is that, it is true that drones are effective, and AI-enabled drones are even more effective. But when it comes to middle power navies, there is a dilemma that confronts many of them, which is that a lot of these drones are actually not being manufactured at home. Some of them are being imported from abroad. And in some cases, the algorithms are also coming from abroad. Now, that means that as you get technology from abroad, you actually don't own that technology. And there is always the fear that there might be a risk of shared liability as you use these, you're also using links, for example, that are not under your control. And so there's this fear that, the equipment and the technology that is being sourced from abroad does not give you the kind of autonomy that you would ideally desire. And that means that you actually don't want to get too much from abroad. You want this to be slow and steady, develop your own systems, use them in a way that maximize your options, but that don't compromise on your autonomy. So that's one dilemma. The second dilemma is with regard to AI, and I'm completely in agreement with all of the excellent points that Caitlin has made about AI, and I do agree that AI can be a real game changer. But I wish to make one point that the maritime domain is a little bit different from, say the air domain or even continental domain fighting on land, which is that that at sea you don't actually want to use force to quell the adversary. What you want to do is to signal to the adversary. You want to be very conservative with the use of force, because when you're operating in the global commons and you're using force, use of force that could result in say the sinking of an enemy ship can have massive repercussions. So you don't really want your unmanned platforms to be trigger happy. You want them to be, you want actually them to take all the time in the world and to signal to the adversary, not to confuse the adversary to take a rash decision, because if the adversary fires at you, you need to fire to you will need to fire on the adversary. And so there is this very peculiar dynamic between combatants at sea that AI can further complicate. That's point number one. The second point that I wish to make is that, with artificial intelligence, there is always this sense that it seems predisposed to a certain kind of data. And that's because it's being groomed, it's being cultivated on certain data that you feed it. It has no mind of its own. It's used to seeing that data. It is used to acting in a certain way. and at sea that can change equations in a way that are undesirable. And so I think we've got to be very careful when it comes to the use of AI, especially in the maritime domain. The third point, and this actually going to be my last point, is that what we actually need at sea is a holistic approach, because the maritime domain is a lot about governance. And if you don't have a holistic approach to developing the technology, the regulatory frameworks, those seas are not just being used by combatants; they are being used by merchant ships. They are being used by fishermen. There's all kinds of activity happening at sea. So if you don't have a regulatory approach that brings in other stakeholders, other agencies, to be able to decide on what are going to be the rules for engagement, if there at all is combat, and even otherwise for sense of regulation and governance, I don't think we are going to have a very good understanding of how to use these unmanned assets at sea. So I would say that slow and steady when it comes to developing the UMS, because if we make a mistake in the way we are developing our technology at the moment, it could result in as Caitlin put it, greater friction, and it could just cause greater conflict going forward. That's where I'm going to stop. Thanks.
Yes, Caitlin, please.
Yeah, just to follow up on Abby's point, Abby, you reminded me of one other thing I wanted to mention, which is like, there's this huge question. Okay, so countries are racing to develop AI, or at least the private sector is. And countries are wrestling with how to adopt that AI and to what extent to adopt that AI into their military systems. But even if they do that, there's this other question about signaling and revealing and concealing the AI technology, which I thought was, you kind of brought that out in the maritime context, which is like, okay, so I have this AI. I don't want it to just be a killer robot that goes and kills things, but I do want it to bolster deterrence. And so how do I find ways to signal to the adversary that I have this AI, I have this capability, without actually employing it in ways that could be provocative? And of course, and of course, the AI is not just used for targeting. We can also use it to improve our situational awareness and for ISR. And those are things I think maybe are a little bit less controversial, but certainly on the targeting piece, a huge question is, okay, how do we use that to enhance deterrence? How do we signal that effectively without being provocative?
True. Just as a follow-up to the point that that Clayton brought out, one of the things at sea is that anything that is uncrewed is somehow seen to be a malign presence. Mm-hmm. So if you're on a ship and you're close to another country's territorial waters, you might not be quite seen as the adversary. But if it is an unmanned vehicle, which is right close to another country's territorial waters, it will be taken out because it will be considered to be, an unlikable, malign presence. So that's one of the things that we've got to keep in mind, that when you're talking of unmanned platform, you've got to be very sure of what those unmanned platforms are doing in contested seas, And we've had an incident, such an incident a couple of years ago. I think it was in 2016, involving two big countries. And that was a lesson learned by both sides, that when you're talking about drones, you've got to be very clear about where those drones and what kinds of waters those drones are operating. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic. I also see that we have a lot of questions in the chat and the Q&A, so I will dive straight into those. I don't think we'll have enough time to cover all of them, given we have 10 minutes remaining, but so that we can go through as many as possible, I'll be grateful for our panelists to keep your remarks brief and to the point, although it's really fascinating, and I'm sure we could go on for much longer. So to start with our first question, the question says, with the rapid development of attachments and enhancements of over-the-counter commercial drones in the ongoing conflict, so it's happening in many conflicts and non-conflict situations as well. What is being done and what can be done to avoid spillover of technological evolutions into other regions and domains? I don't know if Dominica or Caitlin, you want to take this one, or both?
Dominica, go ahead. If you have thoughts on that, I'm not sure I do.
Honestly, I always when the question of spillover, I believe that it's not about avoiding the spillover, because it's already happening. Like, I can see very well how the drone warfare, how the use of drones has been changing our image about the armed drones, is affecting the thinking about drones among European militaries already, with the changements in drone acquisition programs of the deployments. So I don't think that much is being done to avoid the spillover. Is actually to get the lessons learned from how the drones have been used in Ukraine. That would be my quick take on this question. To improve the performance, I believe. Yeah.
I agree. I agree.
Thank you so much. So we have another question, which is again focused on the air domain, which is looking at current research trends. We can see that from a number of research papers published on the topic of UAS, these focus primarily on multi-copters, so quad, hexa, and octocopters, so essentially, as compared to winged UAS drones that we typically identify as aerial drones used in warfare. So what does this change in terms of the trends of UAS usage?
So I definitely have some thoughts on this one. And I think, there's been a lot written about, and Domenica's talked a lot about this, and it's true that in Ukraine, we've seen this emergence of these smaller, low-cost, very cheap drones, primarily octocopters and quadcopters for military use. And that's definitely a prolific trend. The other thing we've seen is the increased use of loitering munitions and a more expendable approach to UAVs because they are so low cost. So clearly this is something that is changing the landscape for drones. However, I don't think every conflict is the same. I don't think we have seen the end of large winged UAS. If you look at the Indo-Pacific, based on the ranges in that theater alone, you've got to have larger aircraft to hold the fuel in the engine. So while quadcopters and octocopters are kind of having a heyday right now, and it is very interesting and important. I mean, they're low cost and they're high. The ability to buy lots of them is in itself a very important quality that they possess. I do think that idea will continue to translate to other conflicts. I just don't think we're literally going to see like UAVs that are that cheap in some of the other conflicts that could emerge in the future, especially in the Indo-Pacific, surely because of the size of the theater, among other reasons.
Thank you so much. And I think that also points to something that you mentioned, Dominica, and the dichotomy in terms of very high end to very low end systems. But I don't know if you have any specific points you want to add on to this question.
Yeah, exactly. The drone is a platform, and it's about the effects you want to have it. Like if it's it depends on the range, on the platform, and whether you control the sky or not. So
yes, agree.
Great, thank you. And now a question on maritime systems, Abhijit. The question says, would we see more uncrewed systems with autonomous target acquisition or firing systems being utilized? And would these be relatively less controversial than land-based usage? Wouldn't the possibility of misinterpretation of a target being civilian or a hostile military target be comparatively lower compared to those which we would see on land?
No, I mean, my response to this would be that detection is certainly something that a lot of countries are focused on. I mean, I can talk for instance, India. A lot of the effort that we see here is actually not towards combat drones. I mean, there's of course the MCM drones, the mine countermeasure drones, but other than that, we're seeing a lot of effort on ISR. The intention being that you've got to have proper surveillance and reconnaissance so that you're able to detect a target, you're able to identify it before you act. And the point is well made that you don't know if it's a civilian target or it's a military target, and you've got to be absolutely sure when you're acting in international waters about what sort of target you face and whether it's hostile or not. Look, intent is very important. You look at a target, you don't know whether it has hostile intent or not. And that sometimes is not the case on land or in the air. wherein you have some idea about, an approaching target is hostile or not, but at sea it's a bit different. So this is the point that I had made earlier, that you've got to be extremely careful about what exactly is it that what posture has the adversary adopted, and what kind of target is it that you have identified, and does it actually belong to the adversary? So these are questions that do need a sort of clear answer, and which is why the entire effort at the moment is towards targeting, is towards identifying, the surveillance, reconnaissance, and identification of what's happening in the contested seas.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. Maybe we can remain with you, as I see another question on the maritime system. Could you elaborate on the risks of using AI technologies at sea? This question is posed because in the autonomous weapon systems debate, you often hear the argument that using autonomous weapon systems in the high seas is likely to be less problematic because of the assumption that the high seas are a more static and controlled environment.
Well, actually, no. Look, the thing is this, that if you're in your territorial waters, it's an area that you control, meaning these are the territorial seas. If there is a malign presence, you can act against the presence. But if you're in high seas, what is a malign presence? I mean, I'm just saying hypothetically. If I am the commanding officer of a warship and I find myself in international waters, confronted with a country with my country is not on very good terms with, is that malign presence? We are both in international waters. So then I need to wait for the other side to take action or to move in a way that seems as hostile movement to me, as a hostile posture to me, and then take a decision. So on the high seas, taking a decision using AI, I would think is all the more risky, especially if you're using it for combat. But if you're using it only as an aid, if you're using it as an aid for, as I said, better surveillance, better reconnaissance, then it's perfectly understandable and it's perfectly acceptable. And that is something that these platforms are actually meant to do. So if we are in international waters and I need to sanitize a region around the fleet, and I'm sending small drones to be able to sanitize that theater, it's perfectly acceptable. But if I'm sending drones out to prosecute targets from another source, that would be more risky, and for that there would be more clearances required, I suppose. So that's what I think about the situation. It can be very risky when you're in offense, but it's simpler, and it's very effective when you're in defense. So defense is acceptable, but offense needs to be thought through before you act.
Thank you so much. We have about a minute left, so we'll squeeze in one last question. I'm really sorry for all the questions we haven't been able to answer. But what are your final words in terms of any advice you can give to governments to proactively monitor technological developments and shifts? For example, should they impose moratoriums on commercial developments, modify or adapt caps on specific aspects, such as endurance, size, etc.?
Well, if you ask me, is that question for me, Sarah?
Sorry, it's to all, whoever wants to.
Okay, no. So my take on it is that I don't think moratoriums work. There's a very clear understanding that when this is the kind of technology, this is the technology of the future, and a number of countries are going to just go for it and develop whatever it is that they need. But I think there's got to be dialogue. There's got to be dialogue between all stakeholders. Everyone that's developing AI and developing these platforms need to come together to develop some rules about how do you want to be able to deploy these platforms at sea. Let's be clear that, I can talk about the maritime domain, that even when it came to the evolution of the UNCLOS and even otherwise the rules for combat at sea, there are a number of countries that sat together to decide, well, what's acceptable and what's not. So I don't see why it should be any different for unmanned platforms, and because the risk here is much is more than it was when we were just talking manned platforms. And the fact is, here we are talking about unmanned platforms acting against manned platforms, which makes it even more complicated and worrisome, actually disquieting, that an unmanned platform can act against a manned platform without rules. So I think all we've got to do is not to talk of moratoriums when it comes to high technology, but talk of ways in which we can streamline the procedures and processes in which you want to play the game, as it were. Thank you.
Please, Caitlin.
Yeah, I agree with Avi. There's no point in moratoriums. The genie is out of the bottle, essentially, with UAV technology and potentially with AI, although the US is looking at ways to sort of regulate that and create more transparency. And I think if anything for the US, I mean, the US sort of had the opposite problem where we've been living under a norm of the missile technology control regime, and we can hardly export any UAVs. And so I think one of the things that could sort of increase the odds of UAVs contributing to peace and stability is actually to get them out there and have allies and partners as well as the US demonstrating their use and sort of from a confidence building perspective, showing both allies and adversaries what the technology can do and saying and being very clear about that. And I think sort of that transparency could actually contribute to some of the stability that we need with this new technology.
Thank you. Dominica?
If I may also chip in, I would just like to underline the fact that technology is not going to provide any silver bullet to your problems. That this military technology racing is just a symptom of inherently political problems. And if political actors are defining like responsible use of new technologies, which is fine and important, but if you don't know the objectives, what is the objective of developing this technology? What are the requirements? Because the technology, it's capability agnostic. It's very difficult to impose any restrictions on it then. So that will be my thing. But thank you so much for the discussion. This was really excellent.
No, thank you all to the attendees for their excellent engagement, and especially to all the panelists for your very fascinating remarks. I'm sure we could continue this discussion, and I'm sure the discussion will continue. But thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your days.